Welcome to the Renal Research Institute's Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology, where we share knowledge and advances in kidney research with the world.
In this episode, we discuss the CONVINCE study, a prospective randomized multi-center clinical trial designed to study high-volume hemodiafiltration versus high-flux hemodialysis treatment. The study assessed morbidity and all-cause mortality, as well as patient-reported outcomes. My guests of this episode are Professor Dr. Peter Blankestijn from the Department of Nephrology at the University Medical Center Utrecht, Krister Cromm, Expert Director Patient Experience, Clinical Research at Fresenius Medical Care, and Dr. Sandip Mitra, Consultant Nephrologist and Honorary Lecturer of the University of Manchester. They are here to discuss with me this landmark study. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Like many others, I was really deeply impressed by the results of the CONVINCE trial. And everyone who reads this paper may read it with a slightly different angle. A first question I would have is actually, can you summarize in a few sentences what each of you thinks the most important outcome of this study? Maybe Peter, if you want to start.
I think this study actually for the first time shows that when high volume hemodiafiltration is consistently delivered to patients, that results in a reduction of the risk of mortality, so an improvement of the quality of treatment of end-stage kidney disease patients. And indeed, actually, we as a group were very excited when we heard, when we learned about this result.
I find that this is actually an amazing outcome. And what I find so striking about CONVINCE is that actually it already started off with a very, very good first step, and that was the development of patient-reported outcomes within the trial. So even though we did not truly co-develop the questions with the patients, we did have true meaningful interactions with patients, qualitative interviews, and we really found out about topics that were worth investigating for patients. So that would span from fatigue, recovery after dialysis, different symptoms during dialysis treatments and in between that were not really part of the conversations between doctors and patients before. And that is how we really got the conversations going and the interest going from the patients bottom up. And I think that is the truly amazing part about CONVINCE, that we were able to actually convince patients to participate and say, look, we actually want to share our experience here, and that will allow later generations also to truly change the way patients or everybody in kidney care actually deal with the problems and develop new maybe treatment paradigms, different ideas of how to approach dialysis care. And of course, hemodiafiltration is a great example because we all believed in it, and we all knew that if we were able to deliver consistently high convective volumes, that we would actually be able to show differences from the patient perspective. And this is something that we will later on present, after the mortality differences that have, of course, sparked this huge amount of interest in the study.
To me, having practiced nephrology for many years, and I have a program that actually is able to offer Ep2 to patients, CONVINCE is a landmark trial in in-center thrice-weekly hemodialysis. And there are several reasons for it. Clearly, there's a survival benefit in patients with high-dose hemodiafiltration, as defined by the CONVINCE study itself. Most importantly, consistently delivered compared to standard of care high flux hemodialysis. So when it's considered still to liver, there's a 23% reduction in all-cause mortality, and particularly benefiting patients with AV fistula, high flow rates, and a relatively low comorbid burden. The second important outcome for me as a practicing nephrologist in dialysis is a huge lesson in that high dose can be achieved consistently over a period of time when the dialysis conditions and the patient characteristics are favorable, and that this dose appears to make a difference and it matters for our patients. There are other factors in outcome measures that I haven't seen quite published yet from the CONVINCE trial, but I'm presuming it's coming, such as patients' quality of life matters, patient-reported outcomes, etc. So does it make patients feel better is an important question, and it matters for our patients. But that, I presume, is part of ongoing sort of studies and analysis ongoing. And before I finish, I guess one other outcome matters to me is that it has delivered one of the best hemodialysis trials, which I believe is the reason why it's secured such a high impact publication, a remarkable achievement by the investigating team under very difficult circumstances. Very good balance between the two arms of randomization, very high retention rates in dialysis recruitment, and of course, delivered during the COVID pandemic. So the trial is unique in many ways, and those are important lessons to learn for us as clinicians and researchers practicing and trying to answer various questions in dialysis and how to deliver the trial.
Peter and Krister and Sandip, thank you really so much for what is the most important aspect to you. Now, there is something that one cannot read in the paper, and this is really the history of the study. How actually did CONVINCE come into fruition? I mean, was this a meeting? I mean, can you just say, maybe we spend a minute or two on the history of CONVINCE? Because I think this is certainly very interesting. How did the two of you learn from each other? How was the consortium formed? I mean, no one would wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, let's do a study on high volume HDF." So, if you can shine some light on that.
The concept of hemodialysis filtration, of course, already exists for decades. And it's only about 15 years or so ago, or maybe a little bit more, that this online production of fluids was, well, more or less accepted by the regulatory authorities. And that created the possibility to address the question whether it really matters, the concept of hemodialysis filtration versus standard hemodialysis. And indeed, 4 trials tried to address that question, all done in Europe, but none of the trials were allowed to draw a final conclusion. We did a individual participant meta-analysis on all the data of these 4 trials, and when doing that, there was a clear suggestion of a benefit for hemodialysis filtration as compared to the standard hemodialysis, especially when high volume was administered. And this 23 liter, that is not a result of a long scientific discussions. It was simply the lower end of the highest tertile in this meta-analysis. So that's end of story with respect to this number of 23 liter. So basically, when we did this meta-analysis, that was 6 or 7 years ago, and the end result was there's a clear suggestion, but there are some methodological issues. So the world was actually divided in believers and non-believers. And then all of a sudden, the European Commission came with this call, which they named Comparing Efficacy of Existing Therapies or something like that. And then I thought, well, this is the golden opportunity to submit the idea of doing a trial again, comparing the two therapies, but now hemodifiltration with consistently delivered high dosage. And this consortium, this group already exists because we tried earlier already in the European grant system to obtain money for a trial. So basically the group already more or less existed. We submitted this idea, and it was awarded with grant money from Brussels.
Had quite a different route into Convince, I have to say. So for me, it started far away, not even in Europe. I was in Hong Kong at that time, and I was doing research on resilience resources of dialysis patients. So I looked at hope and optimism and self-efficacy, things that really, influenced quality of life of dialysis patients. And my research interest simply was how, these aspects interact with different parts of quality of life, right? Does it interact with physical functioning? Are there more mental aspects involved? What about fatigue, depression, anxiety? That all are very, very important for dialysis patients really achieving a holistic good outcome, from the perspective of the user of dialysis therapy. And at that time, I met Professor Bernard Cano in Asia Pacific, and we were talking about quality of life in dialysis. And we then stayed in touch. And I knew that there had been an original grant application in 2014 that had actually not been successful, also because the European Commission wasn't quite sure how this would actually benefit the individual citizens directly, right? To ensure a better playing field, better outcomes in healthcare across the member states for the patients. And that's how the conversation really started again on patient-reported outcomes. And when we applied again, I had the opportunity to then meet Peter, and we were discussing how could this be measured, right? How could this really be made into a turning point potentially for the trial or beyond that, maybe even for nephrology. So we really had high hopes. And that's why I said, look, we should use electronic patient-reported outcomes. We should really change the granularity. We shouldn't just, ask patients thousands of questions and pieces of paper that, nothing will be changed from the patient's perspective because they won't see how all these questions relate to an outcome. And that's how we started the conversation. And that's how we also brought Matthias Rose, Professor Rose from Charité, into the consortium. And we had long discussions about what the right methodology would be, what we still needed to develop, what different types of questions we needed to ask. And we also decided to use a system that later on could be used for something that's called computer adaptive testing, so that patients are actually only asked questions that are relevant to them personally. And that would reduce the number of questions to be asked because, the questions wouldn't repeat. And that's how we all started with selecting PROMISE, patient-reported outcome measurement and information system, for this study and adapted. We started embarking on this journey together, and apparently we were really able to convince the European Commission that this was the right way forward, and got everybody excited, and here we are.
What I really like about this history is that really, again, it's the collaboration between very different disciplines to identify the intersection and create something that's clearly more than the sum of the two parts. I was just wondering, while you were talking, Krister, this whole concept of crumbs in an HDF RCT, was this embraced by everyone from time zero, or were there discussions, or because this is such a novel aspect, and not all nephrologists may have known the methodology, and so I'm curious here.
And recall that we had heated discussions, and that was great because we really engaged in true scientific debate, across the borders of different disciplines, and looking at the advantages and disadvantages. And there were lots of voices that said, well, maybe we can't even deliver on it, right? It might fail. People will not fill in the surveys online. There could be all sorts of things that could go wrong. But yes, I mean, it was worth taking a risk. And I think also it wasn't only cross-sectional, but across disciplines, but we really had, I think, different age groups involved in the trial, with people with very different experiences, different countries, different mentalities, that really made this worthwhile. Also on a personal level, because I think we all got closer to each other and understand each other's perspectives and experiences, and really respect that we can contribute something.
Peter, what was your thought when you heard for the first time about this?
We sort of designed the study, of course, already years ago. That's 6 years, or maybe even close to 7 years ago. And at that time, patient-reported outcomes were really very new. The SONG initiative maybe was, only started early, shortly before. So the whole thinking about patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, taking into consideration, was very new at the time. The moment that we decided to go for this grant application, we had a discussion. Well, it has to be a good old-fashioned trial with good old-fashioned clinical endpoints, all-cause mortality. At the time, we indeed discussed, well, let's make it innovative in some way. And then patient-reported outcome was a logical choice. And at that time, I did not know anything about patient-reported outcome. From the very much beginning, I had the feeling that this could be the diamond on our cake, because that was really innovation, and really innovative development on a large scale. And that was the nice thing of this European grant system. We could apply this on a large scale and do all these developments Krister just mentioned, because there was money for it, and time, and people who are willing to do that. So in due time, it became even more interesting to me as a physician, and I was even more convinced that this is really nice what we are doing, and important for the field.
I think that especially the inclusion of PROMs will have a long-lasting impact. And that this trial may be one of those model trial that, at least in terms of design and inclusion of PROMs, will be replicated in the kidney field over and over again. I mean, this is just my humble opinion, but I think that also in this respect, this trial sets itself apart from many other trials, so from all other trials that have actually been large RCTs that have been conducted in the kidney field.
What I can actually say is that I am actually very grateful to Peter to taking that leap of faith towards something not so well known, because the easier route would have been to lay the focus more on the health economic part and to look for an established patient-reported outcome questionnaire, rather than saying, okay, we turn this upside down and we really start with what exactly is important, right? What types of patient-reported outcomes are important, and that he actually forged this understanding within the consortium that we should not actually see it as a risk, but really as a true opportunity to turn things around. And yeah, I think that is really making the difference. And I can only agree with you, Peter, that this will definitely serve as a role model in a way for future studies.
Peter and Krister, you're so intimately knowledgeable of the trial. What do you think are the main limitations of the trial? I mean, everyone can read the discussion section where I think you spelled out some of the limitations, but are there others that you would think are relevant and for our audience to be aware of?
An often heard comment is the whole discussion about generalizability. And so the question, does this result apply to every patient? Which is a logical question. And the answer is probably no, or that is difficult to say a strong yes. Because in such a clinical trial, and the way we designed it and the way we defined inclusion criteria, it was inevitable that there was some selection. And the main issues in the list of inclusion criteria which resulted in some selection is this likelihood of achieving the 23 liter, which was a clinical judgment by the dialysis staff. And secondly, the willingness and the being able to fill out or to participate the patient-reported outcome assessments. This inevitably resulted in the somewhat better or less diseased patients within the end-stage kidney disease population. That is true. And some people find that a limitation. Personally, I very much disagree. I think this is not a limitation, but this is actually a strong point of the study. Because by this selection, we were able to find out a group within the end-stage kidney disease patients that experience benefit of this treatment. So does this apply to all patients? The answer is no. And the study clearly gives some indications the specific type of patients. So those without clinically apparent cardiovascular disease, those without diabetes, and those with a AV fistula, which actually was 80% of the population. So that is not such a convincing finding. I personally think so. But in all, they're relatively good patients. But by finding that, it's great to know that the relatively good patients apparently benefit of this treatment. And that is nice.
Thank you, Peter. Krister, what do you think?
We think that the picture is obviously complex. And the reason why I say this is because I visited most of the centers and I've spoken with a lot of the patients. And I know that at least within the Fresenius clinics, hemodiafiltration filtration was quite common in a lot of the centers. So it wasn't the case that we, would only recruit those patients that, had the best chances of being successful in the trial. And at the same time, we of course see that patients have done remarkably well. And the story could be actually related to a lot of aspects, right? It could be related to the care. We also know that patients who are regularly asked for their well-being usually do a lot better because there is more of a loop between the care team, the doctors, the nurses, and the patients themselves to find, the best possible outcomes for the patients. And I wouldn't be surprised if this has also happened within Convince, that we have actually had relatively, average, so to say, population of patients, groups of people, and they were just treated very well. And people have found solutions for those patients. So that actually gives a lot of hope from CONVINCE. And I think the only regret that I personally have is that we were not able to bring in more patients and more countries into this trial. And we tried very, very hard. Peter still, I think we both recall, we wrote letters to the ministries in different countries, especially to Poland, really asking them to participate. And it was quite difficult because we weren't sure if patients were, being reimbursed for their treatment if they participated in this trial. And I can only hope that within that rather complex framework of the European Union, we can convince people to actually participate in those trials, because what this trial has shown is that patients definitely benefit. So I would hope that, in future trials like this, this could serve as an inspiration for, regulators to allow this trial to take place. And we now have, surveys for patients in 8 different European languages. And I would certainly hope that we could add a lot more languages inside of Europe and outside, so that we can actually use this trial to help this interaction between practitioners and kidney patients.
Yeah, so these are certainly very, very important points. Now, Sandip, you have been a co-author of a paper that appeared, I think, 11 days after the publication of the original trial in nephrology dialysis transplantation, and it had the title "Hemodiafiltration for All, Are We Convinced?" So I'm really very interested, Sandip, what would be your primary concerns about CONVINCE?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think Peter Blankestijn here and Krister has already been alluding to some of the scientific questions that have been sort of delved into, and that happens with any RCT. Many questions arise, sometimes more questions than answers that have been delivered by these trials. So we were delighted to see a trial delivered in such a effective way, delivering the outcome measure. The main concern has been, as Peter and Krister are saying, is the patients that have benefited from the therapy had a relatively low comorbid burden, which is diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and obviously more older patients than the younger ones, those very early on in dialysis, within 2 years, and others, and that just means that it benefits less. A lot of patients are excluded in dialysis. I'm really pleased to hear the description that Krister has given in terms of how the selection process went. That's not quite detailed in the paper, and was generally a discussion point in such meetings as to how did the recruitment happen. Was there any unconscious bias in delivering these in recruiting patients? So it's really reassuring to hear that it was really efforts made by the units to achieve those convective volumes. But looking at the patient population that benefited, it excludes a lot of patients in dialysis. And that is in itself quite intriguing, because hypothetically, the hypothesis driving many hemodiafiltration trials in the past and more recently has been the cardiovascular benefit. We've always felt that people with high disease burden, high cardiovascular disease burden, are likely to be particularly benefited by this therapy. And so it sort of challenges that biological plausibility that, as a nephrology community, that we've actually been posing. And of course, the cardiovascular deaths weren't as different as the infection-related deaths. Again, challenging our assumption that mechanistically we understood how these therapies work. Perhaps we need to rethink how inflammation, infection, and the cardiovascular outcomes are interlinked with each other. But certainly, the study seemed to challenge some of these hypotheses and made us, question or pose questions around these outcome measures. One of the things that Krister has again pointed out is the care that was delivered to these patients. So there is a natural bias in delivering high volume HDF. You have to pay greater attention to dialysis prescription. And that itself, combined with very high fistula rates, create a scenario that is not quite the norm in dialysis units. Can I create an 82% fistula rate in my dialysis units? It is not the norm, essentially. And that was a major issue as to how can we deliver benefits to all more inclusively to all our patients with a technique that will offer benefits. And of course, the issue around case mix or the ethnicity. So largely a Caucasian population, of course, recruited into the study. My dialysis center population is a different mix of patients. So, how do we study this therapy or dialysis techniques to be more inclusively studying patients? That's perhaps for future trials that we pay greater attention to inclusivity, and we've already heard around how languages, translation, etc., can be incorporated in these trials. So there's those few issues to sort of consider from this trial, and then of course the other factor that has perhaps again raises a question is around it wasn't quite the high blood flow rate, but it was particularly the use of AV fistula, because both the groups are very well matched in terms of high blood flow rates, but the prevalence of AV fistula rates were high. That could mean two things. One is that it is not possible to deliver such a benefit with catheters or drops, but equally, the catheter patients may have been disadvantaged by being much lower in number, and therefore not achieving, the critical sort of quantum that is required to show the benefit. Or is it that even in these patients with the delivered care that is required, one can achieve better outcomes? So there is perhaps some disparity here in access and how we offer access to these patients. So a lot around not just the hemodiafiltration technique, but around the care. And I think I would have loved to see some of the practice pattern data in the paper, or perhaps in a subsequent paper. I think we can learn a lot around the practice patterns in these units to see how this study was actually delivered.
Thank you, Sandip, for these important comments. I mean, actually, as a scientist, I very much like the fact that trials challenge pervasive hypotheses, and I was particularly interested really also to see that HDF, for whatever reasons, and we just can speculate here, and also in agreement with previous data, may have indeed a strong beneficial impact on infectious outcomes and on inflammation possibly. And I mean, we don't know the answer to that. It's just an observation, but I think it's an important hypothesis to further explore. Any thoughts around that?
I think our a priori hypothesis was indeed, as Sandip correctly mentioned, a beneficial effect, probably mainly on the cardiovascular mortality part. But I think it is important to realize that the hazard ratios are all in the same direction, in the direction of a benefit of hemodiafiltration, and it happens to be significant for infection and not significant for cardiovascular disease. And in our earlier meta-analysis, it was just the other way around. So I think the overall conclusion could be that in both fields, cardiovascular and in infection, there could be a beneficial effect. And indeed, one other limitation you might say of this study is that we cannot say anything about the mechanism. And I think that is indeed the case, most likely, at least that is my personal interpretation, that there is not one mechanism, but there are multiple mechanisms that could be of significance. And which mechanism is more important than another mechanism, I simply do not know. But that could also be a strong point of hemodiafiltration being a general and a generic, non-selective type of intervention which is really different from, let's say, a pharmacological intervention. We probably agree that many of the pharmacological trials in end-stage kidney disease patients failed to show benefit because they only target one mechanism. And that is maybe the good thing of hemodifiltration, that it potentially affects multiple mechanisms. So overall, I think that in terms of mechanism, or which of course is from a scientific point of view, very interesting discussion, it will remain a discussion with much speculation. At least that's my personal opinion.
Okay.
And I believe, that's perhaps the reason in the setting of the trial, it's not possible to collect biological samples, etc., just for biomarkers and uremic toxins, etc. But that just was the nature of the setting we were undertaking. The trial was being undertaken. But it does seem like a question that is an open question that still remains as to the biological feasibility. But do you believe, Peter, it is to do with the uremic spectrum of the clearance profile of these techniques compared to more conventional dialysis techniques?
It seems logical to think that the enhanced clearance of uremic toxins, or of certain groups of uremic toxins, could be of relevance, could be at least part of this discussion on mechanism. But to what degree, whether this is 30% of the explanation of the outcome or 50% or whatever percentage, I think that is impossible to say.
And the other thing that really intrigued me was that, given that that uremic burden concept and the enhanced clearance of this technique, the patient group that seemed to benefit more were the ones who were very early on in dialysis, within the first 2 years of dialysis. I know we didn't have data on residual renal function, but that seemed to be, again, something contrary to how we would have envisaged a better blood purification treatment to work. Any thoughts on how that could have result in that sort of an outcome? Do you have any idea of the patient groups that were in the trial in the first couple of years of dialysis?
Of course, I agree, Sandip, with you. And I think, may I quote Michiel Botz, who is the methodologist of the trial, and he always tells me as a clinician, you clinicians, you always look so with a microscope to all these numbers, but these detailed analyses should be interpreted as explorative. Full stop. Explorative. And that's all. So he really tries to let's say tune down the enthusiasm or the relevance of such analyses.
Thank you both for this very good discussion. I'm wondering, in your mind, and this is a question really for all three of you, I mean, what will the future look like? Will there be a pre-convince era of dialytic kidney replacement therapy, the post-convince era? What do you think are next steps? And maybe, Krister, would you mind starting?
Really, this type of schism with convince, and it's not quite as visible yet, because what I believe is that it actually showed in a trial that it is possible to use electronic patient-reported outcomes regularly, and that they should be included in regular assessments. And I think that there will also be a lot more opportunities for predictions. So, and actually start discussions with patients. If you're going down a specific road, you will be able to achieve something, or you may be able to do a trade-off. And there will be these discussions. And that I don't think that this has been the norm in nephrology, because there was simply not the data available for it, so that people could speak with confidence what potential outcomes are possible, and to actually refocus that. So in that sense, I believe there's really a lot of room for future research with a very different focus, a lot more partnering with the individuals concerned, and that will definitely lead to a different way of organizing healthcare. At least this would be my hope for this trial.
Yeah, thank you, Krister. Sandip, what's your view here?
Yeah, I think it's put a spotlight on the fact that, trying to focus attention on the technique and the practice of dialysis could deliver better outcomes. And clearly this study is, as I said, quite a landmark sort of study in that setting, unlike many negative dialysis trials we've experienced in the past. But as we discussed, dialysis is a one-size-fits-all therapy in daily practice. It's pretty much homogenized in dialysis units. And here is a study which is showing benefit in a group of patients particularly. So in order to transform practice, I believe we need to add momentum to this through a few unmet needs. One of them is perhaps the power of additive trials. We've seen some real momentum in nephrology producing 3 or 4 RCTs on SGLT2 inhibitors that have really transformed the landscape. And there is quite a galvanizing effect of additive trials showing similar benefits. And in this regard, hemodialysis is particularly in a sweet spot because there is an ongoing trial in the UK called H4RT, similar in design, almost done at the same time with a slightly longer follow-up period, but aiming to achieve the high target volume rather than restricting patients to who do not achieve the target volume. Therefore, more wider net cast and more inclusive in terms of patients who are recruited into the trial on HDF high volume target group. I think that might give us a bit more answers to the generalizability question. I'm glad that the study has completed recruitment in follow-up phase, but it will report in 2025. So we've got to wait for those data to come through. But that might be a good addition to the evidence that we have to really draw conclusions, because we do need to try to define consensus and guidelines around practice. The care domains that are required to deliver good outcomes will be important. The second element is implementation of these therapies always lag behind the evidence in a big way. And in dialysis particularly, there are not just believers and non-believers. There are units which practice HDF and there are units which do not offer HDF. And for these two different categories of centers, there are two different challenges. The ones who are practicing HDF, can they deliver high dose HDF? That requires the greater engagement of clinicians and nurses in the patient groups that we talked about. And that in itself is an implementation sort of ask, I guess, from the clinical and the practicing teams. The units which haven't got HDF offering at the moment have got different set of challenges, perhaps greater ones, because there are costs to set up hemodialysis treatment. Water quality assurance is important. There is quite a major upheaval in terms of how they practice dialysis, some units do reuse, etc. So the wider practice of hemodialysis will be limited by units which do not currently offer HDF. And we need to address some of those challenges. Cost would be a barrier to it, regulatory concerns, safety issues, all these things need to be delivered. I think, that will be a major challenge. Of course, there are also issues around environmental constraints where water is a scarce resource. Does it provide some of these effects? So for those units, there are major questions to be answered and delivered to address those unmet needs. But I think the other, as I said, I started off by saying, is that one big sort of take-home message is that dialysis community can deliver large trials. And remember, the DOPS gave us the first indication that the high dose of HDF may matter more than the HDF itself. And maybe we need to, submit these grants and look for funding opportunities to do these large trials collaboratively, be more inclusive, so that we can deliver some positive results and start improving outcomes. So there are these two sort of challenges here. Do we personalize treatment within a dialysis unit and sort of break the mold of one-size-fits-all treatment based on some of the findings we're seeing in these studies? And how do we overcome some of the implementation challenges, which are beyond the scientific audiences, more around the payers, the health systems, the disease burden?
Thank you, Sandip. Again, very important points you're bringing up. And Peter.
Well, thank you. I very much agree with the points you just mentioned, Sandip. This one-size-fits-all concept is probably incorrect because in many aspects of medicine, it doesn't work like that, a one-size-fits-all. And of course, dialysis is organized like that. Of course, I agree with you, but maybe that is incorrect. So there's a great need for better prediction of effect. And that's one of the ambitions we have, to go deeper into the data set and trying to find out if we can predict in more detail what subgroup of patients benefit especially. And maybe also on the other end of the spectrum, to what subpopulation it doesn't really matter or has no additive value as compared to hemodialysis. You maybe know that we have done such an analysis in this trial of the meta-analysis data set of the 4 earlier trials, and that generated actually some really nice results, basically quite identical as we have found now. So the somewhat younger patients, the non-diabetics, the patients without cardiovascular disease, benefited especially in that analysis that we did in the 4 previous trials. A second issue, I think, is there a pre-convince area and a post-convince area? Personally, I think the answer is yes. And of course, I'm not unbiased to address such a question. One aspect is also the fact that we were successful in doing such a trial in this type of consortium, and that is quite special as well. And I happen to be the chairperson of this group, but it was really fun to do, and I think it was great that we could work with these 3 big dialysis providers who actually delivered most patients to the trial and came up with these results. So apparently it is possible to do big trials in dialysis, and I think that is a message of major significance. With respect to what to do tomorrow, so that's an often asked question. At least I've been now contacted by many of my colleagues, and they say, well, okay, this is very interesting, but we do not hemodiafiltration. What do you advise me to do? And indeed, I think Sandy correctly mentioned, if your infrastructure, your dialysis unit, is not able to deliver this really high quality water, then there's need for a big investment. If your dialysis machines are not sufficiently equipped to do that, then you need a big investment. And there's also a learning curve with respect to the dialysis stuff. So indeed, there is, if you only do hemodialysis, so you start from scratch, there is quite a bit of investment. That is correct. But once you have done these investments, and that is more or less a sort of one-time investment, then price differences are limited, my guess is. And this environmental aspect, when we started the trial, that was not on the agenda. But Sandip is, of course, I very much agree with you that basically the environmental impact of hemodialysis in general and of hemodiafiltration in particular, of course, is considerable. So that is really a task, I think, for the industries, together with the field, to find solutions to reduce substantially, dramatically, considerably. You choose the word you want. You think is most appropriate in this respect. Reduce the environmental impact of both the standard hemodialysis and hemodiafiltration. And I think that is a topic for tomorrow and the coming years.
I fully agree with what you are saying. I mean, there is major challenges ahead of us. To me, the CONVINCE trial was actually a big sign of hope on multiple levels. First, that actually we as a nephrological community can come together and just pull this off with support, in this case, from the European Union, from academia, from dialysis provider. This is, to me, this gives me a lot of hope for the future. It gives me also hope that we have a positive trial, right? So this is another important aspect for me. And of course, hypotheses are challenged. I mean, that's the entire history of science exists of challenged hypotheses, and that's a good thing. But at least we know now in summer 2023 where we stand on, and of course I'm eager to learn what next steps will be, both in Europe, in Asia, and also here, of course, in the United States. I really want to thank all three of you. This has been a most wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to our continued exchange of thoughts.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining the Renal Research Institute for this episode of Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology. We invite you to engage with us on our social media channels and look forward to seeing you again soon for the next episode of Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology.